Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Touch Tank Tuesday. My name is Olivia, and I am the educator here at the Deep Bay Marine Field Station. We are an education and research facility that is part of Vancouver Island University, and a lot of our research focuses on shellfish aquaculture, and our local marine environment. As part of our education program, we have our invertebrate touch tanks, and they're downstairs right now, but we are upgrading them and they will be upstairs. So when we do open to the public, eventually, you will be able to see some new displays and our new touch tanks. And hopefully when they're ready, maybe they'll be featured on Touch Tank Tuesday as well. Okay, so let's get started. Today we have a very special guest from our touch tank. We will be seeing the sand dollar. So you can see it right now on the side here. And what I'll do is I will make that a little bit bigger for you. So you can see there are two sand dollars here. One of them is at the top and the other one's kind of overlapping it, but we're zoomed in a lot right now. And that's so you can see sort of its body parts. And let's see if I can switch this. Oops, we will switch these. Now I'm big and it is small. But let's see if I can switch this. Okay, well, now you can see both of us. But today we'll talk about sand dollars in general, and we'll also talk about this species, and this species is the eccentric sand dollar. And that's the species that you will find basically here on the West Coast. There's only one species of sand dollar that is in my species guide for the North. Oh, hi, Lisa, the Pacific Northwest. And that's this one species, the eccentric sand dollar. And sand dollars are pretty much just burrowing sea urchins. So they are very closely related to sea urchins. And you'll see that a lot today as we kind of describe their habitats, their lifestyles, and their body parts. They're all very, very similar to sea urchins. So we will get started now. I'll talk first about sand dollars in general, then I'll talk about this species. And if you have any questions, please post those in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer any of your questions. If I can't answer your question or maybe I don't see it, I will come back later to answer that question for you in the comment section. I'll write an answer for you. Okay, let's get started. So let's talk about the family names. At this point, if you've seen some of our previous sessions, you will have heard about Echinodermata. So hi James, welcome. So there's that big group, Echinodermata, and if you remember from previous sessions, that includes sea stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers. And Echinodermata basically means spiky skin. So these are these invertebrates, so they do not have a backbone, that have spiky skin. So that's the big phylum, Echinodermata. Then you have a smaller group or the class Echinoidea, and that basically includes all of those sea urchins, anything that's sea urchin-like, so anything that's round and spiky. So we kind of went from spiky skin in that big group that had sea stars, and then we went to this smaller group, this class Echinoidea, and that's basically round and spiky. So sea urchins. And then we can further split into sand dollars, which there are many different species of sand dollars. They're within that group, and it's a hard to pronounce one, Clypeasteroidea. Clypeasteroidea, and that is the order. So basically anything in Clypeasteroidea in that order is a sand dollar. There's also something called a sand biscuit. So they're sand dollars, but because they're not as flat as a sand dollar, they're a little bit more like a sea urchin. They can be called sea biscuits. But mostly we'll talk about sand dollars today. And really that's the only difference between a sea biscuit and a sand dollar is just how flat or not flat they are. And if you have gone to the beach before, I'm sure some of you have seen sand dollars before. Usually when you see them and when you think of a sand dollar, you probably are thinking of its test. So this is the test of a sand dollar. And what happens is when a sand dollar dies, its spines fall off, its skin degrades and it gets bleached by the sun if it's out on the beach. So that's why they're so light colored like this. So they end up being kind of silver, and this is the test, kind of like how you saw the test or that calcium carbonate skeleton of a sea urchin. So you can see the thickness is really different here. And so here is that sand dollar, and that's the test. And remember, the test is made of calcium carbonate, and it's basically all these tiny little plates that are fused together to create a skeleton. And so sand dollars, basically previously, beachcombers in the past saw these, and it reminded them of the Spanish dollar. And so that's how they got their name of, you found a few at the ocean. Very good, James. That's great. And so before coming here to Deep Bay, I had only ever seen the test before. But if you go out during the low tide here at Deep Bay, you can find them anywhere, at least in front of the station here. And they are in huge clumps and huge groups. So when I'm walking out in low tide, I try to walk in more of a rocky area, because these sand dollars, what they do is that they hide under the sand. So they burrow into the sand. So there's just some mud or sand on top of them. And so if you're walking, you might see these round circles all in the mud. And hi, welcome from Milton. So you'll see all of these circles everywhere in the mud. They clump together in groups, and I'll talk about why the eccentric sand dollar does that a little bit later. And so when I went out walking, I learned the hard way that if you walk in the muddy area, maybe you're going to step on sand dollars. And so I try to avoid that area because they are very hard to try and avoid. But they are the live sand dollars. So like these ones here, and I'll move this over just so you can get a better look. So this is the sand dollar. And this sand dollar is sort of a black velvety color. The eccentric sand dollar can be many different colors, from brown to black to like a purplish color. So they can be many different colors, and they are a very unique species. Sand dollars in general, so in that order, Clypea asteroidea, they live in the intertidal zone, usually the low intertidal zone. They eat algae, so they have to live in areas that have photosynthesis. So as long as light can come into that area, it's great. So then it can create, the algae grows and that sand dollar can eat. So they don't tend to live in very, very deep areas because they do depend on algae. And they also live just under the surface of the sand. So they're just under that sandy area. And they can be found all over the world in many different environments. But just here in the Pacific Northwest, I think we just have this species, although there are different species that just haven't really been studied. So there are sea urchins that kind of look really strange, and those strange sea urchins might actually be sand dollars. So there's a huge amount of studying that needs to happen on these species. So let's talk about sand dollars and specifically their body structure. Kind of what we talked about a minute ago here. And if you have any questions, please do post them in the comment section. So the main part here is that test, remember? And so this is covered by this velvety black skin. So it's this velvety skin that you can see here when I touch the sea urchin. And that skin is covered in tiny little spines. So unlike the sea urchins that have those long spines, the spines that cover the entire body of the sand dollar are actually very, very small, and they have different functions. The spines of an adult sand dollar help it to move. So the spines that are underneath are a little bit longer, and coordination movement of those spines allows it to move across the sea floor. And these spines help it to bury itself, so it can actually move down under the sand. And that kind of brings us to the shape of this shell. It really is built to live in the sand, and it's very hydrodynamic. So we'll talk about their feeding strategy a little bit later, but you can see that water can pass over the shell very easily relative to this. So the mouth of the sea urchin is on the bottom. It would be very hard to catch anything from the water instead of using its teeth like a sea urchin usually does. with this body structure. But with this body structure, the water can get funneled underneath. So they really use the current, and they've adapted to where they live. And so the sand dollar test is, again, that hard calcium carbonate. That calcium carbonate helps to protect it. So it's also easily and readily available in the environment and can be created by the sand dollar, but it's also just very strong. It helps it with currents. So if it lives in a very wavy area, it helps protect it from maybe hitting those stones. It protects it, hopefully, from anyone walking over it on the beach. So it's really, really good for protecting the sand dollar. And it has that pentaradial symmetry. If you remember from all of our other echinoderms that we've looked at, that pentaradial symmetry is basically that its body is created of 5 sections. And you can see that beautiful sort of flower shape on it. So you can see there are 5 sections. And they radiate around a central disc. And that's the case for all of those ones we talked about, the sea cucumber, the sea star, now the sand dollar, and the sea urchin. So those all have that pentaradial, so 5, symmetry. And that's just important for understanding how they've developed. And their symmetry is really important also in kind of determining what species they are. And I'll talk about it later. The eccentric sand dollar is a little bit different than some other sand dollar species. So it has those spines, and it also has tube feet. So you might wonder about this beautiful flower petal shape. Well, all of these are just these tiny little holes, these little perforations. And these holes are where the tube feet come out. So tube feet come out the top, and they also come out the bottom. So here's the bottom of the sea urchin. This is what lays across the sea floor. And the hole in the center is where its mouth would be. So that's where all of the food gets put into. And so there are tube feet that go along the bottom. There are 5 rows, 5 sets of rows. So we get back to that pentaradial. And what's interesting about the sand dollar that's really different than the sea urchin is it actually excretes its waste out this hole down here. Yeah. So that's where the waste comes out. So the mouth is here, the waste is here. So with the sea urchin, the mouth is here, and then the waste comes out the top. So it is different. They both have Aristotle lanterns. So the circle here on the inside, there's a tiny little structure that's its feeding structure that has tiny teeth. And it's a lot smaller because of the shape of the sand dollar. It can't have it be very wide like the sea urchin can. And so that's where its mouth is, but the tube feet go all along the bottom. So the tube feet, and we can see here the cilia. So it has cilia that go all the way along. So I'm just going to get my hand in here, and you can see these are the cilia that my finger are going across. And so we can see them really well on the outside of the sand dollar right now, but they actually do go all the way around the body. So they're on the edges, and then they are also underneath. So let's see there. So this is the live sand dollar, and that's how you'd know a sand dollar is alive, is that it has this velvety coat, velvety skin all around it. And you can see all of these cilia, and these cilia help to catch food. So unlike the sea urchin, who uses its tube feet just for locomotion and its spines for locomotion and sensing, what the sand dollar does is it actually feeds with its spines, its tube feet, and its cilia. So if there's any algae that's in the water, it'll catch that algae in its cilia or tube feet or spines, and it'll pass it towards the mouth. That's right at the center here. Oh, and you can see the teeth. You see those 5 spots in the center? That's where the Aristotle lantern is. Yeah, so it's really cool underneath this one. So instead of excreting waste out the top, like a sea urchin would, the sand dollar excretes it out the bottom, but at the top, it has a set of tube feet as well. But these tube feet aren't for moving because it does not walk upside down. The tube feet help it to breathe. So it uses the tube feet for air exchange, so gas exchange. And so it doesn't use those ones for moving. And what's also really interesting is that they don't use them for holding on to substrate. So if you remember with the sea urchin's really hard to get off of a surface. Oh, this sand dollar is moving. Look at it go. It's moving on its own. So it's escaping our view here, but this is great. So you can see how a sand dollar kind of moves. And it's very rigid looking, its movement, because it's carefully moving all of its tiny little spines to allow it to crawl away. And so it does not suck on to a substrate, so it doesn't latch on with its tube feet, which is really interesting because the sea urchin does, and it's really hard to take off of any kind of surface. And so we've already talked about its feeding. It tends to feed off algae, and it uses basically its entire body to catch that algae in the water column, and then it passes it over to its mouth. So it passes it all along. And let's talk about this species. So the eccentric sand dollar is really quite interesting. It has a couple of interesting facts about it. So it lives from Alaska to California, and it can live up to 13 years. So that's a pretty long time. It's longer than I expected for a sand dollar. So they can live up to 13 years. And it does have some predators. Some sea stars do eat it, and some fish do. But otherwise, it doesn't really have a variety of predators. I think it was just the flounder, also a sunflower sea star, or a pink star are also the predators of the sand dollar. You can see the sand dollar has decided to stop here, but now we can see it a little bit better. Yeah, so those are the main predators. It is really interesting because of the way it feeds. And I will show you here on my screen, just so you have a good idea. I'll come back up here just so that you can see it sideways. So I'm going to bring a towel here, and I will grab a sand dollar for you to look at. So this is the sand dollar. And so what it does is, okay, so here, this is the top, the front, and this is the back. So right where I'm pointing right now is where waste would be excreted. So what it does is it burrows into the sand, but on an angle. So it'll burrow into the sand like this. And it does that in areas that have huge water flow. So if the water is flowing by, it will position itself like this. And as the water goes across it, the water pushes all of the water gets pushed under the sand dollar. And so it's a really cool feeding habit. And what they do is they actually will group together. So all of them will group in one huge colony, and that helps to push the water closer to their mouths with all of that algae in it. So that's why you can find them in huge clumps. Actually, you can see the spikes. Let's see if this will zoom in. See if it'll focus. There we go. So look, so if you actually touched it, it does not feel like velvet. It is very spiky. So you can see all of that, all those spines right now. They're very short, unlike the sea urchin. And these sand dollars are so cool. So I'll just put it back in the water because I don't want to upset it too much. The eccentric sand dollar is very sensitive to temperature. So if low tide coincides with a very, very, very hot day, then there's huge numbers of die-offs of sand dollars. So if there's that huge fluctuation in temperature, they're very sensitive to that. Apparently, they're sensitive to ocean acidification as well, probably at its larval stages. And so in terms of reproduction, there are both male and female sea urchins. So they're different, but you can't see it from just looking at their shells. You would actually have to open them up to see what reproductive organs they have. But what happens with reproduction is the females will release the eggs, and then the males will fertilize them externally. So they'll be out in the water. Then those eggs get released into the water column, and just like some of those other ones we've talked about, they will settle after going through a couple of phases of changes. They'll settle as a juvenile and begin to grow. Here is a really tiny sea urchin. not sea urchin, sorry, sand dollar. This is a tiny one that I found that is just the test. So you can see how small it was at the time that it died. Yeah, so they are really amazing. Some cool adaptations to their environment. So they live in these muddy intertidal areas. Sometimes there are really high currents. And what happens is in areas with high currents, sand dollars will create a heavy test. So those adult sand dollars will have very thick tests that make them heavier. So as the water comes by, they won't get swept away with the current. And for the young ones, so it would be more like this, so this juvenile, what they would do is they'd take sand in. So they would actually bring sand into their mouths, and they would just put sand in their mouths to help to hold them down. So that current's coming through and they don't want to get swept away, they will just start eating sand. So that's an amazing adaptation to where they live and water flow. Also, if we think about the sea urchin and we look at its shape, so these are really closely related. So they're really closely related, but they're very different looking. And we can see this as an adaptation to their environment. So a sea urchin lives above the sand, so it sits on the surface. It might sit on some rocks, but you can see its body structure is quite rounded and ballooned out because it sits on top. And then its feeding structure is a lot bigger. It has those very sharp teeth, and it tends to scavenge and eat. Whereas the sand dollar lives under the sand. So you can see that body structure is completely different. It lives under the sand. So it feeds from suspended material. So instead of scavenging along the sea floor, it scavenges in the water column. And so it doesn't need that huge mouth. It needs something that's a little hydrodynamic. So it will sit in the sand and it will get water flowing around it. So the entire shape has changed as an adaptation to its environment. So just being under the sand, sometimes up out of the sand a little bit, it's absolutely amazing how different they can be, but how closely related they are. Okay, does anyone have any questions? That's about all I've prepared for today. I will make our live sand dollars a little bit bigger so you can see them here. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can see those are cilia, tube feet that are coming out. Some of those tube feet, basically you can identify them by, there's a tiny circle on the end of those outcroppings. That's how I know they're tube feet at least. And so they're reaching for things in the water. You can see the spines are moving as it's moving. Some of those tube feet do help with moving as well, but they're just not as suctioned to the bottom as those sea urchins. Yes, I think they're so cool as well. Anyone have questions about them? And we talked a lot about it, so I think it's so cool how many, at least when I went out, how many sand dollars were out there in the intertidal zone. I was absolutely amazed. Here at Deep Bay, I ended up collecting about 7 from the intertidal zone, just because we have a education collection permit, so we can bring these live critters into our touch tanks. So now we have a couple for whenever we're open to the public. Whenever COVID-19 restrictions end up lifting, we will be able to have you in to see the sand dollars that we have. So lots of exciting ones. And it's very cool just watching it moving here. It moves pretty fast. I don't know for other species, but for this species, Lisa has asked what the lifespan is. And the lifespan is about 13 years. So they live to be up to 13 years old. It could be longer, but that's just the longest known. And the way people are able to actually age them is through growth rings. Apparently they have growth rings. Oh, you collected 15. Really cool, James. So they have these growth rings. I don't know how many years are associated with each growth ring, but you can kind of see these rings. I'll see if I can show it to you. They're kind of a coloration. Let's see, underneath. You can see there's like a white line that kind of goes around in a circle. I think that's the growth ring, but I'm not sure if it's like a year per ring or how many months per ring. It would be interesting to be able to date them. But you would only be able to date them from their shell, so they would have had to have died, unfortunately. Oh, great. Lori, you're asking what I was just saying. Really great question. So you can tell their age by these growth rings. I was just showing here. It's really hard to see, but if you look in a circle, it's kind of like a tree. You see that color change here, that white line that kind of goes around. That's like a growth ring. So that would help us to age how old it is. It's not the spine. That is where the spines are. So usually, yes. So Lisa, they do breathe. So it helps with gas exchange. So they do breathe through the top. So those tube feet that pop up out basically this flower design here. So there are tiny tube feet that extend out of the flower design. And that is where they have gas exchange. So yeah, that's basically where they're breathing. So it's just an exchange of gases through the skin. And James was asking if that was the spine. I'm not sure what part. For what we were looking at, ooh, they really did move fast. Oh, okay. Sorry if there's some delays here. So you can see there are tube feet here in this picture, but the really short, dark colors that go all the way around, those are the spines, really tiny spines. Great question, James. How do you tell it from a girl or a boy? You can't really tell from the outside. So if you just looked at one on the outside, clearly a live one, you would not be able to tell from a dead, dried one. But from a live one, you can't tell from the outside. They don't have sexual dimorphism. So that being that there would be a physical difference between female and male seen from the outside in like their features, but they do have different genitalia. So on the inside, you would either find gonads, or with females, maybe you'd find the eggs on the inside. So that's the way that you could tell. You could also tell while they were spawning, whether they were spawning out these little orange eggs, which is what happens is that females will send little orange eggs out into the water. And those eggs are really, really thick. They have this very thick sort of jelly coating all around them. And what that does is it helps them not get eaten by all of the other adults. So you can imagine that by mistake, they might end up eating the eggs. So, so that jelly coating helps to make sure that they don't get eaten. Really good questions. Okay, if anyone has any more questions, I am very happy to answer them. I will come back and try and answer them. If you are asking questions on another platform and maybe I haven't seen them, I will make sure to come back and answer them for you. Yeah, I think it's really cool. These are really cool critters. Oh, Lisa asks if it's spawning time now. I don't know. I would think that it would be soon, but I don't know what time of year these spawn. That's a really good question. I will maybe take a look and see when this species spawns because it would be really cool to know. Okay, thank you all for joining us, and I will see you next week for Touch Tank Tuesday. Goodbye. Bye.